or the surveillance. The fire was still burning when Elena drove away from the house, her hand steady on the wheel, her eyes fixed on the dark road ahead. Behind her, orange flames consumed the kitchen window. Ahead of her, a $1.2 million bank account waited to be claimed. 13 hours earlier, that Sunday had been perfectly ordinary. The silver fork scraped against the porcelain plate with a sound that set Elena's teeth on edge. She pushed a piece of roasted chicken through a pool of gravy, her knuckles white as she gripped the cutlery. The dining room was flooded with bright Sunday sun. It caught the crystal glasses, the linen napkins folded into perfect triangles, the slight sheen of sweat on her forehead that she'd wiped away 3 times already that meal. "The chicken is a bit dry this year, Elena." Just a critique. Martha's voice was sweet poison. She sat across the table in her pleated silk skirt, her gold ring catching the light as she reached for her wine glass. The woman had perfected the art of insult delivered as concern. Elena's jaw clenched tighter. Metal on ceramic. That horrible scraping sound again. Martha stood suddenly, the silk rustling around her like wind through dead leaves. She excused herself with a flutter of her hand, turning toward the hallway. "Just a quick bathroom break," her gesture suggested. "Nothing of consequence." Elena tilted her head. She could see the hallway mirror from where she sat, a large gilded frame that reflected the console table beyond. The brass bowl sat there, the one Mark's mother had complimented last month, the one where they kept the spare keys. She watched Martha's reflection as the older woman's hand darted toward the table. Fingers closing, a soft chime of metal keys clinking, the blue leather key tag. The one labeled "spare." Elena watched it disappear into Martha's black leather handbag. She watched Martha's eyes dart toward the locked master bedroom door, the one upstairs where Elena kept her most private things. Elena stood abruptly. Her glass of red wine tipped over, and the dark liquid spread across the white tablecloth like blood pooling from a wound. It happened in slow motion and all at once. The glass fell. The wine bloomed. Mark looked up from his plate with an expression of mild irritation. "Clumsy," he muttered, not meeting her eyes. Martha was already back at the table, napkin in hand, fussing over the stain with theatrical concern. "Don't worry, dear. These things happen when one is unsettled." Elena didn't respond. She was watching Martha settle back into her chair, watching the slight bulge of the key ring pressing against the leather of that black bag. She was thinking about the spare bedroom key, the spare to everything in that house, the spare to all her secrets. The lunch ended. Martha lingered, sipping her coffee, making small talk about the weather, the neighborhood, her church group. Mark cleared plates without looking at his wife. Elena sat frozen, her hands beneath the table, her fingernails drawing crescents of blood from her palms. When Martha finally left, Elena walked her to the door. She watched the older woman settle into her silver Mercedes. She watched the car back out of the driveway with a kind of careful precision that suggested Martha had all the time in the world, all the time she needed. At 2:15, Elena was on the gravel driveway in her broken heels. The stones crunched loudly beneath her feet as she sprinted toward the Mercedes, already moving down the street. Her heels kicked up dust and small stones. She reached for the chrome door handle, her fingers grasping at air as the car accelerated. "Open the purse, Martha. I saw what you took." The scream came from somewhere deep in her chest, a sound she didn't recognize as her own. Martha's face appeared in the side mirror, composed, glacial, untouched by Elena's desperation. Then Mark was there. His navy sweater filled her vision, His hands closed on her shoulders, thumbs digging into her skin with a pressure that was less than accidental. He shoved. Hard. The world tilted. Elena's heel snapped as her foot hit the ground. She heard the sound of breaking wood before she felt the impact of gravel against her palms. Red bloomed. Bright. Immediate. The skin of her hands scraping against the stones. Pain and shock mixing into something numb and distant. Inside the Mercedes, Martha's hand moved to the lock button. Click. Electronic and final. Through the tinted glass, Elena watched her mother-in-law's expression remain utterly blank. The engine roared to life. Exhaust smoke rolled across the driveway. Mark stood over her, a long shadow stretching across the gravel. His finger pointed down at her face like a weapon. "You're losing your mind. Stay away from her." His voice was ice. His breath smelled like the scotch he'd drunk before lunch. Elena watched from the ground as Martha's car pulled away, accelerating smoothly down the street, the red taillights disappearing around the corner. At 9:00 p.m., Elena was in the basement. Her flashlight cut through the gloom, the beam playing across decades of accumulated storage. Cardboard boxes labeled Mark's College sat stacked in the corner. She kicked them aside, one after another. The sound of heavy cardboard sliding across the concrete echoed in the empty space. Dust rose up in clouds. Her hands were shaking, not from fear anymore, but from something else. Something colder. She reached up to a high shelf and pulled down a dusty jewelry box, the kind her mother had given her as a wedding gift. Red velvet lined with silk compartments. The hinges creaked as she forced it open. Old earrings, costume jewelry, nothing, but jewelry boxes had false bottoms. Elena had always known that. She'd kept one herself as a teenager for the things she didn't want anyone to see. Her fingers found the edge of the fake bottom and tore at it. The wood splintered. Her fingernails broke against the old varnish. And then, a small black USB drive, no bigger than her thumb. A handwritten note, yellowed with age. She unfolded the note. The script was elegant, unmistakable. Martha's handwriting. 3 words in perfect cursive. Evidence for the divorce settlement. Elena's grip on the USB drive tightened until it left an imprint in her thumb. The flashlight rolled from her other hand and clattered to the concrete floor, its beams spinning wildly around the basement. Shadows danced across the walls. The beam caught a corner, the locked storage cabinet where Mark kept his personal items. It caught the tiny reflective surface of a camera lens taped inside a basement vent. The USB drive clicked into the laptop port at 10:30 p.m. Elena sat at the desk in the home office, the door locked behind her, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The metal connection sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. The screen populated with data. Hundreds of MP3 files arranged in folders by date. June 12 bedroom, July 4 kitchen, August 22 bathroom. Each file name was precise. Each was a location. Each was a moment. Elena's hand moved on autopilot. She clicked a file at random. Audio played. Static, then her own voice, whispering in the darkness of the bedroom. She was talking to Mark about her pregnancy fears. She was crying. She could hear it now, the tremor in her voice as she explained why she wasn't ready, why she didn't know if this marriage could survive another fracture. "I don't know if I'm ready, Mark." Her recorded self, vulnerable and desperate. Then, a beep, electronic and cold, and a second voice underneath her own, faint but unmistakable. "Excellent. The feed is clear." Martha's voice, speaking from inside her bedroom, speaking from inside her most private moments. Elena's eyes snapped upward to the ceiling. The smoke detector. White plastic, innocuous, installed by the home inspector 5 years ago when they'd bought the house. She stared at it, her vision blurred and focused. There, a tiny hole, barely visible unless you knew to look. A pin-sized aperture. A red LED pulsed from inside. One beat. Pause. One beat. It was watching her right now. At 11 p.m., Elena grabbed her laptop and moved toward the front door. The deadbolt was brass, heavy, secure. Her fingers were slick with sweat as she fumbled with the mechanism. The lock was too tight. Everything was too tight. She could hear Mark moving in the living room, the clink of a glass, the scrape of a chair. She twisted harder, felt the mechanism begin to turn. His hand slammed against the door. Palm flat, the thud reverberated through the wood and into her bones. Mark loomed over her, his face a mask of cold fury. He smelled of old scotch, of something darker. "Where do you think you're going with my mother's property?" His voice was low and threatening. A voice she didn't recognize, though she'd been living with the man for 7 years. Elena didn't answer. She gripped her laptop and swung it like a weapon. The edge caught him across the cheekbone. Blood bloomed, bright and immediate. A line of red that started at his temple and ran toward his jaw. Mark roared. He tackled her into the hallway, and they crashed into the coat rack with a violence that sent jackets flying everywhere. Winter coats scattered across the floor. The heavy wooden stand toppled with a crash of splintering wood. Elena's breath left her lungs. She tasted blood. Hers, maybe his, maybe both. Her knee came up. It connected with something soft and vital. Mark's grip loosened just enough. Elena kicked free and scrambled toward the kitchen, abandoning the laptop, abandoning every thought except forward. Her hair was a wild mess. Her hands were shaking. Her broken heel dragged uselessly behind her. The kitchen was where Mark caught up with her. He limped in slowly, deliberately, wiping blood from his face with a kitchen towel. The white cloth turned red as he pressed it to his cheekbone. Elena backed against the refrigerator, her hands reaching blindly for the magnetic knife block on the wall. The 10-inch chef's knife slid free with a metallic shring that sounded like a scream. Mark reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small electronic receiver, some kind of transmitter or receiver. Elena couldn't quite process what she was seeing. He tossed it onto the marble counter with a casual flick of his wrist. The device played a recording of Elena in the shower, her own voice singing a song she thought was private. The audio crackled and popped, but it was unmistakably her, unmistakably intimate. Mark laughed, a dry, hollow sound that echoed off the kitchen tiles. "Pathetic," he said. But he wasn't laughing anymore. He pulled out his phone. The screen showed a banking application, a transfer confirmation dated 3 weeks earlier. $500,000 from Martha Logan to Mark Logan. A receipt for services rendered. A payment for betrayal. "She pays well for the information I provide, Elena. We're a team. You're just the content." The knife in Elena's hand felt suddenly like it weighed nothing. Like she weighed nothing. She lunged across the island anyway, her body moving on pure instinct, on rage that had crystallized into something sharp and pointed. Mark grabbed a cast-iron skillet from the stove and swung. The metal connected with the knife blade. The clang was deafening, a sound that cut through her skull and left her disoriented. The knife flew across the room and clattered onto the tile. Elena grabbed a glass jar of flour from the counter and smashed it against Mark's head. The glass shattered. White powder exploded everywhere, a cloud of flour that turned the kitchen into a snowstorm. They were both choking on it now, gasping through clouds of white. The air was thick, breathable. Through the haze, Mark's hand emerged. It closed on Elena's throat. His fingers dug in. He slammed her backward into the pantry door, and the wood cracked under the impact. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. There was nothing but the pressure and the white flour and the roaring sound in her ears. Her hand fumbled behind her. She felt the pantry shelf above her head. Her fingers closed on something heavy. A can of soup, she thought later. Something tin and substantial. She drove it sideways as hard as she could. The impact was a wet thud that sent vibrations through her arm. Mark's grip loosened. He fell back, but as he did, his hand moved to the kitchen door. He twisted the lock from the inside, and then, a sound like metal sliding on tile. He kicked the key underneath the refrigerator. The silver glinted once, and then it was gone, lost in the darkness beneath the appliance. Elena was trapped. She stood among the flour dust and broken glass, gasping for breath that wouldn't come. The kitchen suddenly felt very small, very enclosed. There was no way out except through him or through the locked door he now stood between her and... Mark wiped flour from his face. His cheekbone was already swelling, blood mixed with white powder, creating a pale pink mask. He was smiling. You should have just signed what Mother told you to sign. The side patio door opened at 11:35 p.m. Martha stepped inside with the precision of someone entering her own property. She wore a trench coat over her ruined silk skirt. Her hair was perfect. Her makeup was immaculate. In her hand, she held a tablet. The smile on her face was the smile of someone who had never doubted that she would win. She turned the tablet screen toward Elena. A 4-split screen. Kitchen, bedroom, bathroom. The third frame showed the basement storage closet where Elena had found the USB drive. All 4 feeds were live. All 4 showed different angles of the house. All 4 were recording everything. Martha slid a document across the marble island. It was a voluntary commitment form for a psychiatric ward in upstate New York. Elena's name, Elena Grace Logan, was already typed at the top. The signature line at the bottom was blank, waiting. Sign it, and we don't show the police the video of you attacking Mark with a knife. You're unwell, Elena. Erratic, violent. Martha's voice was matriarchal, certain. The footage of your little outburst in the kitchen, that's very compelling evidence. A disturbed woman attacking her innocent husband, trying to kill him. That's what the police will see. Unless you cooperate? Elena looked down at the knife on the floor. She looked up at the camera in the smoke detector, its red LED pulsing steadily. She understood now. The entire fight had been a performance. Every impact, every scream, every moment of violence, captured and recorded and ready to be presented as evidence of her insanity. Martha pulled a syringe from her purse. The needle glinted under the kitchen lights. It was filled with clear liquid. The cap came off with a soft click. Just a sedative to make the transition easier, Martha said pleasantly. You'll wake up in a nice room with padded walls, and by then, this house will be in our name. Your accounts will be frozen. Your reputation will be destroyed. There's no way out of this, Elena. There never was. Mark grabbed Elena's arms at 11:45 p.m. He pinned them to her sides and forced her down into a kitchen chair. Her arms were twisted behind her back. There was no leverage. No way to break free. Elena was crying now. Deep, body-racking sobs that made it hard to breathe, hard to think. Her spirit was collapsing in real time. Martha advanced with the syringe raised. The shadow of the needle grew long across Elena's face as the older woman moved closer. The needle was only inches away now. Elena could see the fine point of it. She could see the liquid inside the barrel. She could smell Martha's perfume, something expensive and overwhelming that made her gag. Her eyes fell on the counter. The spare key tag. the one Martha had stolen from the hallway console. It was sitting there, next to a bottle of high-proof whiskey that Mark had left out after his afternoon drinking. Elena's hand inched toward it on instinct, a final desperate movement of someone with nothing left to lose. Martha's thumb began to depress the syringe plunger. The needle moved closer. Elena could feel the air displacement as it approached her neck. In 3 seconds, it would be over. In 3 seconds, she would lose consciousness, and everything would be taken from her. In 2 seconds, she would have made her choice. Elena grabbed the whiskey bottle. She smashed it onto the gas stove without thinking, without planning, without anything except the desperate need to break the moment. Glass exploded. Liquid amber flooded the burners. She twisted the knob with her free hand. The world became fire. A wall of blue and orange flame erupted from the stove with a whoosh so loud it seemed to come from inside her own chest. The heat hit her face like a physical blow. The flour dust in the air ignited. A secondary explosion, a bang that was felt more than heard. The pressure wave threw Mark backward, his hair singed. His grip on Elena loosened. She grabbed the tablet from Martha's hand. The older woman screamed as the flames caught the hem of her silk skirt. The scream was high-pitched, animal, utterly devoid of the composure she'd maintained all evening. She was screeching now, a sound of pure panic as fire crawled up her leg. Elena grabbed a kitchen chair and swung it at the patio door. Glass shattered. Shards rained down like diamonds. The cool night air rushed into the burning kitchen, feeding the flames, drawing them higher. Elena sprinted through the broken glass toward the driveway. Her car keys were in her pocket. She found them by touch. Her fingers closed on the familiar plastic fob. Behind her, the kitchen was engulfed. The flames climbed the walls toward the ceiling. Martha's screaming continued, a sound that seemed to belong to another world now, another life, another Elena entirely. She didn't look back at the burning kitchen window. She didn't slow down. The car door opened to her key. The engine started. She pulled out onto the street with the kind of speed that sent gravel flying, that would have looked frantic and desperate to anyone watching. But Elena wasn't frantic. Elena wasn't desperate. Elena was walking away from the only life she'd ever known, and she was doing it on purpose. The diner was a neon-lit box 10 miles from the house. Elena sat in a vinyl booth, her hands finely steady, her breath finally even. She had the stolen tablet in front of her. She had the USB drive, carefully removed from her laptop and placed in a plastic bag. She had logged into the diner's Wi-Fi password without the waitress asking any questions. The waitress had simply brought her coffee, black, strong, exactly what she needed, and left her alone. The recipient list was long. 43 email addresses. Martha's church group, the family lawyer, the police tip line, social services, the local news, everyone in Martha's carefully cultivated inner circle. Everyone who mattered. Elena's finger hovered over the Send All button. The confirmation showed 99% complete, turning slowly to 100% sent. The data began uploading. Hours of surveillance footage, years of recordings, audio of Martha's voice explaining the plan to Mark, video of the syringe, pictures of the commitment form. All of it, flowing out into the internet like poison from a punctured vessel. She watched the upload bar advance. 25%, 50%, 75%, 90%. When it reached 100%, Elena opened the tablet's browser and navigated to the cloud backup system. She found the master account. Martha's account, with her login and password stored in the browser history. 3 clicks. The backup deleted. The cloud storage wiped clean. No defense, no secondary evidence, no escape route. She picked up the coffee cup, took a long sip. The coffee was hot and bitter. Exactly right. The diner's bell rang as she stood to leave. She dropped the USB drive into the cup of hot coffee, watching it sink into the dark liquid. The metal of it caught the light once and then was gone, consumed by the heat and the darkness. Elena walked out into the night. The locksmith arrived on Monday morning at 9 a.m. He was a man in his 60s, wearing a gray uniform with his name embroidered on the pocket. He barely glanced at Elena as she handed him the court order. The law was the law. A restraining order was a restraining order. The house was legally hers until the divorce proceedings determined otherwise. He drilled out the old brass lock. Golden metal shavings spiraled downward and collected on the porch like insects frozen in time. The sound of the power drill was loud and final, whirring, grinding, the old lock disintegrating under the force of the mechanism. In the driveway behind her, 2 police cruisers sat with their lights off. Officers in dark uniforms were placing Mark in one vehicle and Martha in the other. Martha was screaming about the fire, about the recordings, about lawyers and lawsuits, and her rights as a citizen. Her voice carried across the lawn in fragmented bursts of outrage. Mark was silent. He sat in the back of the police cruiser with his hands cuffed, his burned face turned away from the light, and said nothing at all. Elena stood on the porch, holding a new set of keys with a bright green tag. A new lock, new keys, a new beginning, though she didn't think of it that way. She thought of it as a locked door and what was on the other side of it. The locksmith finished his work. He handed her the keys and left without ceremony. Elena took one final look at the police cruisers pulling away from the curb. She watched them disappear down the street. Then she looked down at the final document in her hand. It was her own bank statement, not the joint account, not the accounts Mark knew about, the account that had been accumulating deposits for 5 years. 50,000 here, 100,000 there. Small withdrawals that Martha and Mark had never bothered to question because they were too busy with their own plans, too busy with their careful scheme to drain Elena and lock her away and divide her assets among themselves. They had never noticed Elena draining the account dry. The balance on the screen read $200,000. She had been skimming from the joint finances for 5 years, long before Martha installed her first camera, long before Mark started receiving payments for information, long before Elena had even understood what they were planning. She had simply been careful, methodical, patient. The final twist was this. She had known about the cameras almost from the beginning. The one in the bedroom, the one in the bathroom, the one in the smoke detector in the office. She had found them during the first month Martha started her surveillance, and instead of removing them, she had simply performed. She had smiled for the cameras. She had created moments of normalcy and intimacy that gave Martha exactly what she wanted, evidence of a marriage worth destroying. And while Martha was recording, while Mark was downloading, while both of them were planning Elena's incarceration and the theft of everything she owned, Elena was taking it all. She looked directly at the remaining camera, the one in the doorbell that Martha hadn't bothered to disable, and winked. Elena stepped into the house. The door closed behind her with a heavy thud. She turned the new deadbolt. The lock clicked, final and absolute. Behind her, in the driveway, the police were finishing their work. The fire trucks had already left. The kitchen damage contained, controlled, manageable. The house would need repairs. The foundation would hold. The walls were strong. Elena walked through the hallway where she had found Martha stealing keys. She walked through the kitchen where she had fought for her life against both of them. She climbed the stairs to the master bedroom where she had performed her vulnerability for years. She opened the walk-in closet and pulled out a suitcase. The case was black, expensive, built for distance. She had been packing it slowly for 5 years. 3 items per month. Nothing Martha or Mark would notice. A change of clothes in a city across the country. A new driver's license under a new name, obtained through careful and completely legitimate channels. Passport. Money. Everything a woman needed to disappear. Elena packed the final items. The bank statements. The copies of the surveillance recordings she'd secretly made of Martha making the recordings. The photographs of Martha's handwritten note about the divorce settlement. The audio files of Mark discussing payment terms with his mother, like she was some kind of product to be divided and sold. She zipped the case closed. The sound was like a final punctuation mark. The doorbell rang. Elena looked at the doorbell camera one final time, then went downstairs to open the door. On the porch stood a man in a dark suit. He held a badge. He introduced himself as Detective Morrison. He had questions about the fire, questions about Mark, questions about why her mother-in-law had been admitted to the hospital with third-degree burns on her legs. Elena invited him inside. She offered him coffee. She answered every question with perfect clarity and precision. She played the victim beautifully. The woman who had been recorded without consent, who had been poisoned against her husband by his domineering mother, who had fought for her life, and yes, maybe she had made mistakes. But she was alive, wasn't she? That had to count for something. The detective nodded. He understood. He'd seen worse. He didn't think she should leave town, but he also didn't think she was the one they should be worried about. The evidence was clear. Martha had orchestrated the entire scheme. Mark had been a willing participant. They would face charges. They would spend time in jail. The house would be hers. The accounts would be frozen in her favor. It was over. Elena walked the detective to the door. She thanked him. She assured him she would be available if they needed any further statement. She promised to call if she remembered any additional details. Then she closed the door. She didn't reopen it. She went upstairs and she pulled the suitcase from the closet. She went to her car in the driveway. She placed the case in the trunk. She started the engine. She backed out of the driveway slowly, carefully, just like any normal person leaving for a trip. She drove past the spot where Martha's car had burned. She drove past the police station where Mark and Martha were currently being booked. She drove past the bank where she had a new account under a new name in a new city waiting for her. She didn't look back once. The house receded in her rearview mirror. The driveway where she'd been shoved into the gravel. The kitchen where she'd fought for survival against both of them. The smoke detector that had recorded years of her most private moments. It all became smaller and smaller, until it was nothing but a distant shape on the horizon. Elena turned up the radio. She merged onto the interstate. The sky ahead was clear and endless,